All right. Good noon, everybody. Welcome back to Lunch Break Apostasies. Appreciate you tuning in with us. We are about, I would say, about halfway through at this point by the time we get to the Reformation. And we've gone through a lot at this point. We've already been through all the major religions that stay around till this day that are from the time before Christ and a couple that are afterwards. Last time we went over Roman Catholicism, and we didn't get any questions concerning Catholicism. Don't forget, by the way, if you'd like to, you can always message me on whatever platform you're watching this on, and I'd be happy to answer them if it's relevant to what we're talking about. The other thing we do, of course, with previous lessons is we talk about something that is a positive with the apostasy. And it very rarely is the case in which you'll find an apostasy that is all evil on every single end, but it doesn't need to be. And so often there are good things about it, even with something which I have a little bit more resentment towards, say, Islam. Even there's a couple of good things you can point out, and things I wish Christians understood a little bit better. Well, with Catholicism, I would say that would be a general religiosity that Catholics seem to have. And what I mean by that is that a Catholic service is a very religious feeling affair. Now, obviously, religious and religious feeling are not the same thing, and ceremony and ritual can quickly become empty ceremony and ritual, and it should be altogether avoided if it is unscriptural. But often it seems that you'll see people who are worshiping, but at least it appears to be meaningless. And so having a general religiosity is a good thing that you can see from Roman Catholicism. Today we're dealing with the Reformation, and that's not exactly an apostasy, it's more of a movement, but while we study apostasies, it's pretty important to understand the history. In fact, as I've been going through this, I've sort of realized that the history is often what makes the difference, especially today when there are so many different denominations that don't really hold to their historic doctrines any longer. The history is often what makes the difference. And many denominations, in fact, most denominations you see, are going to be able to trace their roots back to the Reformation movement. So let's jump right into it. The Reformation. In order to understand the Reformation, we have to understand the attempts at reformation that happened before what we consider the Reformation. When you look at the history of the Roman Catholic Church, it was a very short period of time in which they sort of had this unchecked power. I suppose they probably had unchecked power in, say, Western Europe for quite some time, and it was always checked by the power of the temporal lords and that sort of thing. There was a balance between, say, kings and popes, and that would wax and wane. But after the schism of 1054, and the Orthodox sort of go their own way, and then you have the Catholics going a different way, that's really when the Roman Catholic Church gains its most power. And it only takes a couple hundred years, though, for calls for reformation of the Catholic Church to become a thing. And we first see this with the conciliar movement. The conciliar movement in the 14th century, that's the 1300s, attempted to limit papal powers by establishing regular councils and reestablishing ties with the Orthodox Church. It also wished to put an end to the practices of simony, pluralism, and nepotism. So what that means is, and by the way, we mentioned this when we were talking about the Roman Catholic Church, the full power of the Pope, that certainly was not the historic teaching of the Roman Catholic Church. He's been slowly gaining in power as time has gone on, and it was only in the 19th century when the doctrine of papal infallibility was adopted. So the actual power that the popes had was going to be around the 1200s, something like that. And that's when they were at the top of it. But the hypothetical power that they have, which, actual power tends to beat out hypothetical power, but the hypothetical power is at its peak right now. And even the time, excuse me, even the time of the peak hypothetical power, or I'm sorry, practical power of the popes, even during that time, it was they still had limitations that they don't today, such as fallibility. Well, by the time you have the 14th century, the Pope being magisterium still hadn't been really established. And so there's sort of a theory, it's almost treated like a legal theory is today, but there's a theory within the church that maybe the councils actually have more power than the Pope. After all, the Eastern Church, or the Orthodox, had been practicing that the entire time, and that was the historical practice of the Catholic Church. So people, realizing the problems within the papacy, they start a movement to create a new council that could override the Pope. Now, the big problem with this is for quite some time within Catholicism, the one who calls the councils is the Pope. But anyway, they think maybe we'll be able to work like this. So, they wish to put an end to some of the practices, including simony. Simony is named after Simon the Sorcerer. It's the practice of purchasing a church office, which was just about the only way anybody received church offices, especially higher offices such as bishop during the medieval world. Um, Pluralism, which is the practice of somebody holding both a uh, a religious office along with a temporal office. Quite often, you might have somebody who is a bishop, but they are also a lord over a certain area, a feudal lord. And then finally, the practice of nepotism, which should be a little bit more obvious. But what you might not know is that the term nepotism actually kind of comes from this era. The term nepotism comes from the Italian word nipote, which means nephew. Um, the practice was of people, say bishops or even popes, they would choose their own nephews as to be their successors. The reason I put air quotes around nephews is these were actually often illegitimate children of the person in question. They would just say, "This is my nephew," because obviously you can't be pope and say, "This is my son." That's not going to fly. At the time of the conciliar movement, at the beginning of it, there were actually two popes. Throughout the history of the Catholic Church, there were a few what are known as anti-popes, but this was probably the most difficult period of that time. One was Gregory the 12th, and then also Benedict the 13th. One was residing in Rome, and then one had fled from Rome and was residing in Avignon, France, which was historically strong Catholic territory. They, the conciliar movement forms the Council of Pisa in 1409. And in order to solve this problem that we got two different people claiming to be pope, we're going to appoint a new pope, and so they elect Alexander the Fifth to be the new pope. Now, if you've ever wondered what happens when somebody sees that there's too many of something and they say they want to simplify it, and so our solution for this is going to be let's make a new one. What usually happens is you don't have just one now you usually have three, and that's what happened there. So instead of having the problem of two popes solved, now there were three competing popes, each one claiming to be the legitimate one. Eventually, the conciliar movement died in the mid 15th century as it itself became schismatic, and eventually there were two separate councils being made at one time. So that sort of put the end to it. The conciliar popes, they ended up being considered anti-popes. And I believe the ones that were legitimized were the Avignon popes, but I might be mistaken. But anyway, the important thing about this is the first time you see people attempting to reform the Catholic Church. By the time you get to the mid 14th century, you find a guy named John Wycliffe. By the way, this is not exactly one for one the history of when it happened, especially with the conciliar movement. So much of it is tied up in something else. It's hard to say, well, this starts here and ends here, and then this guy shows up and then dies, and then this guy shows up. It's a little bit all closer together than that. But John Wycliffe was a professor in Oxford University in England in the 14th century. At the time, Oxford was mainly a theological university, as most of them were. But he was one of the first great reformers to the, or at least an attempted reformer to the Catholic Church. And while he would eventually be considered a heretic, he did have protection of some of the local English lords. And so he was never killed for the things he taught, but he preached against the church having any sort of temporal power. That is, the church shouldn't have armies, the church shouldn't levy taxes, that sort of thing. He taught rather that the church is the invisible body of the predestined, which is half true. It is an invisible body, where I might say he's not being biblical, is the idea that it's only the predestined. The fact is, individuals are not predestined towards salvation. The word predestination does appear in the Bible, but the context every time is referring to the church itself. You are not predestined to go to heaven or go to hell, as much of the Protestant world would have you believe. Rather, the church is predestined to go to heaven, and you have the free will of choosing whether or not you're going to be a part of that church. He gets the idea of predestination from centuries at this point of Catholic theology. Augustine of Hippo sort of had the same idea. He taught against transubstantiation. If you'll remember from last time, we mentioned that transubstantiation is the belief of Catholics that the bread and the wine taken during the Eucharist literally become the body and blood of Christ. By the time of Wycliffe, that was a fairly recent doctrine that was being promoted in the Catholic Church. It might have even been a dogma at that point. Dogmas are considered a little bit stronger in the Catholic Church. I don't think everybody has to agree with a doctrine, but you can't be considered a proper Catholic if you don't agree with the dogma, at least on paper. He believed that the Bible ought to be made available to all in their native language, and thus began to translate the Bible to English from the Latin Vulgate. And he certainly stands out then as the first person who he didn't get finished with in his lifetime, but he's the first person credited with translating the Bible into English. The reason you don't really see Wycliffe Bibles all that much anymore is because he translates it from the Latin Vulgate, which was a translation that involved some already shaky translations, especially in the Old Testament. Jerome used the Greek Septuagint, which is a famously inaccurate translation of the Old Testament. So but he does have an English Bible, although he's sometimes falsely attributed as the first one since Jerome to translate the Bible outside of the approved language of the church. Obviously, you had several Greek Bibles in the Orthodox Church, and Alfonso the Wise, the King of Spain, commissioned a Spanish Bible a century earlier. When you're king, you're able to do that sort of thing and get away with it. Eventually, although he would die himself of natural causes, Wycliffe would be condemned by the Council of Constance, and they ended up digging up his bones, burning them, and then casting them into a nearby river so that nobody would try to venerate him in any way. But he didn't suffer much persecution within his lifetime. There was a movement that's often associated with Wycliffe. He didn't really found them, but they tended to coincide pretty well, known as the Lollards in England, and they were around for some time, pretty much well into the Protestant Reformation really got started. They were highly associated with Wycliffe. They believed in an available Bible, so they were the ones who finished the Wycliffe Bible and translated it into English. They are most identifiable by what they were against within the Catholic Church. They were against, for example, anybody with a clerical position holding civil office. They were against the worship of images, so you don't have statues and paintings that people are going to be praying towards, whether it be the Dulia worship or Latreia worship, um, as the Roman Catholics might make the distinction. They were against prayers for the dead, which, that's if you have somebody in purgatory. By the way, this is going to be really important later. But there's the idea of purgatory. Well, maybe if I can pray for somebody in purgatory, they won't have to be there as long. Remember, purgatory is this place that's temporary, where you sort of burn off the sins before you go to heaven. They were against clerical celibacy. Once again, it was only just around the time of the schism that the Catholic Church started teaching that anybody who held a clerical office, even a priest, must be celibate. They were against pilgrimages, and they rejected the teachings of transubstantiation. A follower of Wycliffe was Jan Hus in today modern-day Czech Republic. He was mostly known in Prague. Uh, he read the works of Wycliffe fervidly, and he had that opportunity because he himself was a professor in the University of Prague. Keep in mind, you don't have the printing press yet, so books tend to be few and far between. You might have 2 or 3 copies of a book, and that's it. Usually, where these copies are going to be sent is universities. And just so happens that Prague was one of the great universities in Europe. Jan Hus was there, and he had the opportunity to read what Wycliffe had written. Read it a lot, and so he preached a lot against the corruption of the clergy. It's often the Latin phrase sola scriptura. It's often attributed to Jan Hus. By the way, if you're wondering about the language, how is it that a guy who speaks Czech was able to read English? It's at the time the scholarly language was considered Latin, and so the works of Wycliffe would have been written in Latin, and then Hus could have read them in Latin. But the idea of sola scriptura is that any authority of any religious nature must come from the Bible. Now, I say we accredited him with the Latin phrase of that because it's not like he came up with that out of nowhere. The Bible preaches that idea pretty strongly. Can't add anything to it, take it away, etc. He also preaches against the selling of indulgences. This is the next step in corruption. If you have this idea that my loved one is in purgatory and I want them out of there, I can pray for them and maybe that will speed up the amount of time they'll be in there. Well, the church starts saying, in a few different times, there was never really a point where the church was doing this all of the time, but there were little points in history where they would start selling these indulgences. That is, hey, if you pay me some money, then, grandma's going to spend less time in purgatory. You want that, don't you? And so you can see the corruption inherent within that. And as a result of all of these things, Jan Hus was persecuted pretty horribly. He was brought to the Council of Constance. And despite the fact that he had noble protectorates, that is, there are people on his side here, and despite the fact that when he was summoned to this council, they give him a letter of safe conduct, meaning, hey, you can come over here and maybe later we're going to do something to you, but for right now, we're not going to do anything to you. You'll be okay. Despite the fact that he had that letter of safe conduct, they burned him at the stake. This was the same council that declared Wycliffe a heretic and had him exhumed and burned as well. Finally, among the pre-reformers, it's probably worth mentioning Savonarola. Now, Savonarola, I don't really count him in the same category because he wasn't trying to reform anything about the practices of the Catholic, or rather the doctrines of the Catholic Church. Rather, he was just trying to get people to live up to the standards that are on paper, right? Jan Hus, Wycliffe, they were trying to change the paper. Savonarola was just trying to change whether or not people were living up to what the paper said. In addition, he's almost more of a political figure than a purely religious one. He's most known as a foil to Lorenzo de' Medici. In the city of Florence, the Medicis at this time were an extremely powerful family. This is Italy, by the way. Um, they're an extremely powerful family, and originally, by the way, this is still the Renaissance at this point, and so you have all of this religious tension. The Renaissance are clashing with the old religious ideas. And of course, when we think of Renaissance art, we often think of extremely religious ideas. Some of the great works of artwork during the Renaissance, they were religious in nature. Uh, Sistine Chapel ceiling, just about any sort of the statues. There are of David. There's statues of Christ. They tend to be religious in nature. Despite this, however, it was seen as a little bit of an affront, scandalous. Um, a lot of it, and you look at some of the religious art in the medieval era versus the Renaissance era, you see that there's people are showing a lot more skin. It's a lot more focused on the beauty, and as a result, there was a lot of tension between patrons of the Renaissance, such as the Medici family, and and the Catholic Church. Savonarola ends up being hired by Lorenzo de' Medici because he is famous for his piety. And he basically says, come over to Florence and start preaching in the city for me. But what he does is he preached against the corruption of the powerful there. He gains a reputation because he ends up selling much of his property and much of the property of the Abbey of St. Mark, where he was assigned to preach, and he just gives it to the poor. So you have the Renaissance, which wants to create all of these great objects of worship, great, powerful looking church buildings. He says, I don't want to spend money on that. I just want to sell this and give it to the poor. He organized the great burnings of the vanities. Vanities being things that people buy that are just self-indulgence. So rich clothing was often done. Books, which were not religious in nature. He ended up banning the carnival, which was pretty that was pretty controversial in Florence. The carnival was part of the culture, but it tended to be pretty indulgent. And eventually he ends up being killed, and once again it was in political circumstances. I think Savonarola is admirable in his actions in trying to make people be more pious, but I personally don't really put him in with the rest of the pre-reformers, but most people seem to, so I thought it'd be worth mentioning. All right, let's talk about Martin Luther. In 1483, Martin Luther was born in the Holy Roman Empire. That's modern day Germany for the most part. He was sent to law school by his disciplinarian parents. And this is already interesting. Martin Luther was not born as a rich person. He was born a peasant, but he's sent to law school. The reason this is important, it kind of shows the changes that are happening within culture. Had he been born just 100 years earlier, he could never be any sort of lawyer. He was gonna be a peasant, and there was nothing else he could do. But by the time you get 1483, the Renaissance have really taken hold, and life looks different. There are some in the lord class which are poorer than some in the peasant class. There are some in the peasant class who've actually made quite a bit of money as merchants, and then some in the lordly class who might have been, knights or something. They find themselves destitute now. So things have been changing. But he did have strictly disciplinarian parents. Apparently, his mother, especially, could be very harsh with the young Martin Luther. One day, as he's coming home from school, though, of course, this is often in a totally different city, so this is a rare visit he's making. It's not as though it's a daily occurrence. He ends up being caught in a terrible lightning storm. And as he ends up praying to Saint Anne that if he would be delivered from the storm, then he would devote his life to God. And there's sort of a twofold reason for this. He's obviously afraid of dying in the storm, but he's also really afraid of what's going to happen if he gets killed here. He's terrified of the concept of hell, and he doesn't want to go there, obviously. And so he says, I'll devote my life to God if I'm delivered from this. He makes the bargain with God. Well, as luck would have it, he ends up not dying in the storm, and he becomes an Augustinian monk. He goes to the monastery of Erfurt, and he's quickly gains a reputation as a pretty good student. But he's also extremely depressed in his nature and very penitent. It's said that he spends hours every day in confession. And what he'll do is he just tries to think of every single thing that might be a sin that he has done this day, and he confesses it to another senior monk. And then when he's finally done with it, he thinks, well, maybe I didn't confess those things for the right reasons. And so he'll just go straight back and confess all again. And it's said that he becomes extremely depressed and worried about his own salvation because of this. Well, he had a superior at Erfurt, and he has the idea to, instead of, because he's got all these problems, he decides to make him a professor at this brand new university in Wittenberg, Germany. We're going to make you a professor of theology. He is inspired by the story of Jerome, who was also apparently prone to a lot of depressive episodes. And so it said that while Jerome was working on his great works, such as the Vulgate, that's when he'd be able to snap out of it. And remembering this, he sends Luther over to Wittenberg. And at Wittenberg, Luther begins to teach, and he starts with the book of Romans. Now, it's at this time that Luther ends up being sent to Rome on a pilgrimage. It was a big honor, and then it was also thought that this might help him focus. But when he gets there, he becomes sorely, sorely disappointed by what he sees. He expects it to be the most religious city in the world, and it is corrupt on two levels. It is corrupt among the common people. It is a city filled with thieves and prostitutes, and even worse, it is corrupt on the higher levels. He sees so much corruption on the part of the bishops. And as a result of seeing, some of the stories are just, they really make it cringe. At one point, Luther was asked to deliver the Eucharist, and as he is praying over it and calls it, he mentions that this is the body and the blood of Christ. It is said that he overheard one bishop whisper concerning the bread, "Bread you are, and bread you shall remain." By the way, as an aside, the bishop was correct, but highly against the dogma of the Roman Catholic Church. And even looking at the indulgences that people are going into, he sees that the bishops are sexual deviants. He's highly disappointed about his trip to Rome. And shortly after this, Pope Leo X began another round of selling indulgences in order to do two things. One, pay off the debts that were incurred by his luxurious lifestyle. And two, to pay for the building of St. Peter's Basilica. Of course, that's the most famous church in Roman Catholicism, and sort of the center even to this day. And the selling of indulgences, as we said, is an extremely corrupt act. And Luther had a problem with it. By the way, Leo X's birth name was Giovanni de' Medici. You'll remember that's the son of Lorenzo de' Medici, who just a few years before was the center of so many problems in Florence. There was one itinerant monk, Dominican, by the name of Johann Tetzel, who was particularly famous for his work in the Holy Roman Empire. He was sort of he would have been today, he probably would have been in the advertising industry. He ends up coming up with a jingle to try to get people to buy indulgences. As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs, says Tetzel. He becomes infamous, and not just in Luther's eyes, among all the people for this. But he's very successful as well. So we have a few things going on here. Luther sees all the corruption that's going on within the Catholic Church. And then he also is being forced to be in a position where he's starting to teach the Bible. And when you start teaching the Bible, you begin to learn things that you never knew before, even if you had a very thorough education. It's just something about teaching that helps you learn things better. And he starts teaching from the book of Romans. Romans has a lot of emphasis on the idea of grace that is given. And he really starts focusing on this grace. And it's about this time that Luther ends up nailing the 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg. Give me just one moment because I forgot to grab this. But I remembered I actually have a copy of the thesis right here. And before we get into the 95 Theses, and these are definitely the more famous ones that happen, he actually had already done something like this called the 97 Theses. Now, what is being done here is, well, the point of the thesis. These are not actually statements that he is putting up here and just expecting everybody to believe. These are sort of considered debate topics that he's putting out here. So when he first writes the 97 theses and nails it to the church door in Wittenberg, it's almost a challenge. By the way, it's not nearly as an aggressive of an act as it sounds like. If I were to start nailing theses to somebody's church door now, that'd be an aggressive act. But at the time, a church door was sort of considered like a community bulletin board. There would have been a lot of things nailed to the church door. Anyway, he nails the first with the 97. And what the 97 had to do with was salvation by works. And he was expecting this to make a big splash, and it didn't. People in the University of Wittenberg would talk about it, but it didn't really spread among that. He was expecting it to make some sort of splash, really make an effect on the culture. And then he ends up writing the 95 Theses. And let me just read to you a couple of these ones. Let's take, for example, thesis number 9. Therefore, the Holy Spirit, acting in the Pope, does well for us when the latter in his decrees entirely removes the article of death and extreme necessity. Meaning, what he's saying there when he's talking about the Pope here is that the Pope does well if he just removes the necessity of spiritual death or purgatory for somebody. Verse 26, thesis 26, the Pope acts most rightly in granting remission to souls, not by the power of keys, which in purgatory he does not possess, but by the way of intercession. Christians should be taught, this is 43, Christians should be taught he who gives to the poor or lends to a needy man does better than buying an indulgence. And you might notice that these tend to be with the topic of the Pope and indulgences. 81. Such impudent sermons concerning indulgences make it difficult even for learned men to protect the Pope's honor and dignify against the calumnies, or all events against the searchings of the laymen. 70. That one, the idea that's kind of against Tetzel, right? These sermons that are being given, they're undignified. 77, to say that St. Peter, if he were now Pope, could show no greater mercies is blasphemy against St. Peter and the Pope. You get the point of what some of these are. And it also, by the way, goes against St. Peter's Basilica. One of my favorite ones is if it is the case that the Pope has the ability to sell indulgences, and he really has the authority to spring people from purgatory, then he ought to do it for free and not have a price for it. These are all debate topics. This one was different. The 97 were all of the theological nature of salvation. And although they were very much against teachings of the Catholic Church, they don't create a splash because they're not controversial and they're not seen as an attack. These ones were seen as an attack against the Pope. He nailed these to the door on Halloween Day in 1517. And the other thing that really creates a splash, you see some of the things, um, if you look at some of these great pre-reformers, one thing they all seem to have in common is they have noble backing. If you were a reformer before this time and you're not really known as a great reformer, it's probably because the Catholic Church burned you at the stake or killed you in some manner as an apostate. Luther did have backing. Frederick the Wise, who was the Prince of Saxony at this time, Wittenberg was within Saxony. He liked Luther a lot, so he doesn't get immediately killed. And because you have the invention of the printing press by Johann Gutenberg, suddenly it's not just the universities that are going to receive these things, but it becomes available to everybody. They translate it into German so people can understand it, and a lot of people are reading it. Eventually, he's summoned to Heidelberg, and it was perhaps a possibility that he'd be burned at the stake there, but he ends up surviving that. The meeting ends up not being seen as Luther committing blasphemy or heresy, but rather enough people see this as just a rivalry between Augustinians. Remember, Luther was an Augustinian, and Dominicans. Johann Tetzel was a Dominican. And so in that case, he was able to survive it. It wasn't the only time he was put on trial, though. The greater time was during the Diet of Worms, Worms being a city in Germany. Shortly after the 95 Theses, Charles V, who was, I believe, of the Habsburg family, and a devout Spanish Catholic, was elected as the Holy Roman Emperor. Leo X then prepared a bull of excommunication for Luther. When Luther received it, he burned it. He was then summoned to Worms to answer for what he had done by Charles V. Now, Charles V's power was still a little bit shaky. The Holy Roman Empire was, even though you have a single Holy Roman Emperor, his power isn't necessarily absolute, or at least as absolute as it would be in some of the other kingdoms of Europe, such as England or France. But on the way there, he found himself extremely popular among the peasantry. It said that some of them even would put branches in front of him, recreating the triumphal entry into Jerusalem that Jesus had done. When he is brought to Worms, he is told to recant of what he has taught, and all will be forgiven, but he refuses to recant at that diet. He was condemned, but one of the big differences between him and Jan Hus is Luther also had a letter of safe conduct. The difference was his was honored, and so he was allowed to go home. He was condemned. You still got a problem that as soon as you get home, then somebody's allowed to kill you. In fact, they did send assassins after him on his way home. But Frederick the Wise ended up sending men to kidnap him and take him to a place he could be safe for some time. And he even said, don't tell me where you're taking him. That way he can be honest. If he was asked where he is, I don't know where they took him. And Luther would remain in hiding then for several years. We're going to pause here for a moment to talk about Lutheranism. Of course, the Lutheran Church is named after Martin Luther. So very quickly, let's talk about Lutheranism. Lutheranism has, and historically this has been the teaching, and much of modern day Lutherans still hold to this, that you have three big ideas, the three big alones. And this is something that Luther himself would have taught, and it's still usually pretty well revered within Lutheranism. The first idea is sola scriptura. That's a Latin phrase. It means Bible alone. Well, that's a great thing. You look at a place like Second Timothy 3:16. You find that all Scripture is inspired of God, and in Second Peter verse 1:3, He has given us all things that pertain to life and godliness. Therefore, if you want to be a godly person, you look to the Bible and the Bible alone. You don't need anything else. I love that. That's great. Except they go further than that. They say the Bible alone, but they say a couple other things alone. Sole fide, which is faith alone. Um, that does contradict the Bible. The Bible does tell us we need a little more than just faith. James chapter 2, verse 14 through 17. James condemns the idea that you can have faith and just your belief alone is enough for salvation. Um, it's probably for this reason, by the way, that Luther himself thought very little of the book of James. He called it a right strawy epistle. And then finally, you have sola gratia, that is, grace alone. You look to a place like Romans chapter 6. You look over to a place like Romans chapter 6 and verse 2. Or, well, we'll start with 1. What shall we send then, or say then? Are we to continue in sin that grace may abound? By no means. How can we who died to sin still live in it? So even in the book of Romans itself, Paul does not teach that grace is all that's going to be alone. You can't just say, well, I'm under grace, so I can do whatever I want. That's not how it works. And then as far as authority goes, we also have to mention the Augsburg Confession. You see, after Luther was taken away and sort of hidden away for a few years, he ends up, the movement is now in the hands of a whole lot of other people. At this point, it's still probably strongest in the Holy Roman Empire. And you have these two factions popping up, Catholics and Lutherans. You also have another faction popping up called the Anabaptists, and we'll mention them later. The law that ends up being adopted in the Holy Roman Empire is, okay, it's legal to be a Lutheran so long as that's the law of the land. We're not going to have everybody have a freedom of religion, and you can choose whether you're going to be Catholic or Lutheran, and you definitely can't choose to be Anabaptist, but whatever your prince of your area of the empire has chosen, that's what you're going to be. And in order to distinguish the Lutherans from the Anabaptists, the Lutherans end up adopting what is known as the Augsburg Confession. And even to this day in Lutheranism, that's often cited. Worship in Lutheranism takes the idea of sacraments, which we saw both in the Orthodox and in the Catholics, and it kind of reduces it. Luther believed that there were only two sacraments found within the Bible. That is, baptism. The type of baptism is still for infants, and it is often done by pouring, as pictured here. And then you have the Eucharist. Everything else, by the way, he was correct in realizing that none of those other things were considered acts of worship. In fact, a couple of them aren't even authorized in the Bible at all. But he only considers the two, baptism and Eucharist. By the way, when we go through the Protestant world, you'll usually find that most Protestant denominations accept two sacraments, or sometimes they'll call it an ordinance, which is just a sacrament by another name. And it's usually these two, baptism and the Lord's Supper or Eucharist or communion or whatever. The type of communion that the Lutheran practices, or at least Luther believed in, and once again, in the modern day, practice can be quite different from the historical doctrine. But the Eucharist was not transubstantiation. That is, it's not literally becoming flesh as you eat it or blood as you drink. However, it is simultaneously bread and it is simultaneously flesh. And it is simultaneously wine and blood. The way this is sometimes described is in the same way that God can simultaneously be the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, so can the bread be bread and flesh. So they don't believe that it's turning into something else. They just believe that it is still the body of Christ. Not symbolic for the body of Christ, but still the body of Christ. Hierarchy in the Lutheran Church looks extremely like the Catholic Church. It will be about a century yet before Protestants really start to develop their own aesthetic identity apart from the Catholics. They do have pastors, which are basically what we would consider a preacher, and they don't have to be celibate. They do have bishops, which work essentially the same way as the Catholic bishops do. I don't think they have to be celibate either, but maybe they do. The great governing bodies are the synods. That's the council of a bunch of bishops coming together, and we're going to make rules for everybody within our synod. The Missouri Synod, for example, in America, is one of the greater sub-denominations of Lutherans. That being said, Lutherans really they run the gamut. Or, I don't think I said that right. They there's a large variety of Lutherans, and some of them can be extremely theologically liberal. Some of them can be very theologically conservative, and the same is true for politically, as they tend to be. And so, if you have a more evangelically minded Lutheran, they might not even be part of the synod at all. It's just not part of the hierarchy. They, like I said, they have a lot of holdovers from Catholicism. There's the practice of the private absolution of sin. So that's confession, sort of, except you don't have to go to the priest or the pastor or whatever and say, this is what I did at this time. You just say, I have sinned, and then it's absolved. They do keep the church calendar, which means, Catholic holidays originally, like Easter and Christmas, um, which, of course, a lot of people, even secularly minded, will keep those. Um, Most of the Catholic Church calendar up to that point, so Epiphany, for example, was historically still kept in Lutheranism. There is a partial belief of free will, and I had somebody ask me, how can you have partial free will? And isn't that a logical contradiction? The answer is yes, that's a logical contradiction, but and this is where you still see some of the medieval thinking going on here. Luther was very much a medieval thinker, and I don't say that meaning, I don't subscribe to the idea that people were somehow more stupid during the Middle Ages, or even more ignorant than they were during the Classical era, but they did have a couple of bizarre ways of thinking. And one of those things is they wanted to get rid of some of ancient ways of thinking. The term Renaissance means rebirth. And the rebirth was people were sort of rediscovering things that happened in the ancient world. You had ancient philosophies, so Socrates, Aristotle, Plato, they go back to the forefront of philosophy during the Renaissance, as well as Roman style art and that sort of thing. Um, what The conflict then at that time is if you have a medieval style thinker, they don't care for, ancient thoughts and that sort of thing, whereas the Renaissance probably does. So, ironically, the more liberal side, the side of the Renaissance, are the ones who actually want to go back to an older time. But because Luther was definitely more on the medieval side of things, then things we take for granted, such as logic, which the philosophy of the time had sort of put to the side, he wasn't so worried about it. So if something had a logical contradiction, it didn't worry Luther all that much. Further, by the way, we should also mention this as far as sola scriptura goes, from a couple of slides before. Luther didn't value all the Bible equally. All authority is found within the Bible, in Luther's thinking, but once again, he called James a right strawly epistle. It would be more accurate to say that sola scriptura in Luther's way of thinking means the gospel alone is what we need. And then he kind of kept the power for himself to say, and this book has more gospel in it, good news, and this one doesn't, which is why he valued Romans way higher than James. And you also still have a respect, not a worship, but a respect for the saints in the Catholic Church, obviously, until the creation of the Lutheran Church. We should also mention, by the way, that Luther was not trying to create his own church. In fact, one of his dying wishes was that no one would ever call themselves a Lutheran. Irony. But he wasn't trying to create a new church. Really, none of these guys we're going to talk about today were. They were just trying to change the Catholic Church to something that was closer to Scripture. I can't fault them for that. I can fault them for a lot, but I can't fault them for that. Um, Anyway, that's a quick overview of the Lutheran Church. Much of the Lutheran Church is very theologically liberal now, so you're not going to have an easy time nailing somebody down on any sort of doctrine. That's when we have to keep a couple things in mind. Don't pigeonhole people. If they say they don't believe this, don't say, oh, yes, you do, but sometimes you can't mention the historical beliefs of the denomination they might be in. Ulrich Zwingli. Zwingli's another one, and you don't hear about him nearly as much as you do Luther, but he was almost as influential in Switzerland as Luther was in the Holy Roman Empire. In fact, he had many of the same ideas before he had ever even heard of Luther. He comes to many of the same conclusions. Um, he made many changes away from Catholicism. Um, However, him and Luther they never did see eye to eye. By the way, Zwingli really started to come into his own during this time that Luther had been hidden away. Um, Zwingli, they came really close to seeing eye to eye and unifying their two movements. They didn't quite do it. And it was because Luther ends up making this list of 20 things that Zwingli must agree to in order for them to be of one movement. Zwingli agreed to 19 of them, but he could not agree to the idea of consubstantiation, and as a result, you have two separate movements. Eventually, Zwingli ends up dying in a physical battle against Catholic forces outside of Zurich, Switzerland. Finally, there's sort of a big three when it comes to reformers. Obviously, you have Martin Luther, then you have Zwingli, and then the third one would be John Calvin. Now, John Calvin was not of the same generation as Zwingli and Luther. He sort of comes up in the next one. He's this French lawyer um, who ends up stopping in the city of Geneva and becomes a very prominent theologian there. He ends up writing the Institutes of the Christian Religion, which lay out much of what we consider to be old school Protestantism. You know, anything that Zwingli and Luther were doing, they were still very Catholic in nature. Calvin was very much he's sort of thinking, unlike Zwingli and Luther, not so much Reformed Catholic Church. He's starting to think we're just going to make a new one. Is sort of the way he thinks. It's a little bit more complex than that, but that's sort of the way he thinks. He ended up becoming a civil leader in the city of Geneva, and he was involved with the condemnation of Michael, who was it, Servetus, because Michael Servetus rejected the Trinity, and so he oversaw Servetus being burned at the stake. So don't start thinking that uh, Calvin was some great humanitarian. He wasn't. The Catholics probably would have burned him at the stake too, but so would the Protestants at this time. If you wanted to, if you really wanted to credit Calvin for anything that you see in the religious world today, it would seem to be two things. One, the aesthetics of the Protestant world today. Most Protestant denominations look a lot different than the Catholics, the exception being Lutherans and Anglicans. We'll talk a little bit about them as well. Um, but the everybody else tends to look a lot different than the Catholics. That's sort of Calvin's doing. And a lot of the practices that you see within Protestant churches today that aren't really, doctrine, but it's just this is how we do things. It often goes back to Calvin. The other thing, which is much more dangerous, is the tulip doctrine. Calvin's tulip, which is the basis of most Protestant denominations now, looks something like this. The term tulip every letter in that makes a word. The T stands for total hereditary depravity. That is the idea that you are born sinful, which, by the way, is rejected by Ezekiel 18. And by the way, Matthew 18 makes a pretty strong argument against it when Jesus said that except you become like one of these little children, you can never enter the kingdom of heaven. Well, did he mean that you have to become like one of these little sinners, or is it a type of purity there? So you have total hereditary depravity, which is not taught within the Bible. However, the Catholic world would not have argued with it. What they would have argued with is the idea of unconditional election. That is, that God saves who he wills, and there is nothing you can do to change that. That's once again the idea of predestination. So God is essentially, before the beginning of the world, he decided whether or not you were going to go to heaven or to hell. You can look to places such as Matthew 11:28 through 30 and Titus 2:11 to see, no, that's not really the case either. And then the rest of the tulip doctrine is just the logical conclusion. I mentioned that Luther was medieval in his thinking. Calvin was Renaissance in his thinking. He wanted to be logical, and so the L, the I, and the P in tulip are just the logical conclusions of what has already been accepted here. That is, limited atonement. Not everybody gets to go to heaven. Only some people do. If God is choosing unconditionally, he's not going to be choosing everybody. Irresistible grace. If God has chosen me to be saved, then there is absolutely nothing I can do, which 2 Peter chapter 3 verse 9 seems to contradict pretty well. Look over here. 2 Peter 3:9, the Lord is not slow to fulfill his promise, as some count slowness, but is patient towards you, not wishing that any should perish, but that all should reach repentance. So it is the will of God that everybody should repent. Well, that seems to contradict the idea of irresistible or limited atonement and irresistible grace. If there's really that nothing that anybody could do, and it's all entirely within God's power, and he's going to make sure that you're going to be saved whether you like it or not, then how does that mesh with the idea that he doesn't want anybody to be condemned? Finally, you have perseverance of the saints. That's better known as once saved, always saved. Again, you can look to places such as Galatians chapter 5 and verse 4, in which Paul writes to the Galatians, you who believe that you are saved by the law, you have fallen from grace. So he says people can fall from grace. You'll find that the tulip, in some form or another, and by the way, if you're taking notes in this class, take this down because it is huge in the Protestant world. Either 5-point Calvinism, which is, TULIP, or, by the way, as my dad said while teaching about this, TULIP, spells a little bit like Tigger from Winnie the Pooh. TULIP, that's what the more old school Protestant denominations tend to do. Or sometimes you run into what is known as 4-point Calvinism, which drops the L out of it, which is irrational, but the L does feel pretty bad, doesn't it? Knowing that there's absolutely nothing I can do whatsoever to receive grace, even if I want to really badly. And so some more modern Protestant denominations usually drop that one, which it's illogic. Sorry, I'm having a rough time today, guys. It's illogical, but that's usually the more common form of the tulip. All right, that's the Reformation. I appreciate you bearing with me. I don't know if you could tell I'm a little bit stuffed up today, and I got a headache, and I appreciate you bearing with me on it. Next week, we are going. By the way, you might be thinking to yourself, "Wait a minute. There's a couple of really prominent reformers that DJ didn't mention here." That's because they're going to get their own time on this. But for now, we're going to move away from what is typically considered the Reformation because we're still trying to stay somewhat historical in order. And we're going to go to the Anabaptists, which I mentioned. So we'll be talking about the Anabaptists next week. Thank you very much for your attention. Look forward to speaking to you again soon.